My name is Rabbi John Rosoff. I know many of you, and I welcome all of you from around our community to this special event. I'm the senior rabbi here at Temple Israel of Hollywood. And on behalf of our sponsoring organizations, J Street, the Los Angeles Jewish Journal, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Valley Beth Shalom, Congregation Ikar, and Temple Isaiah, it's my honor, truly, to welcome you to this public conversation between Jeremy Ben-Ami and David Suissa, including my colleagues, Rabbis Ed Feinstein, Zoe Klein, Shmuley Yankowitz, and Sharon Brous. Tonight's conversation is badly needed, not only here in Los Angeles, but across the Jewish world. Indeed, we Jews have always engaged in machloket, controversial conversation, and argument whenever the great moral, ethical, religious, and national issues confront us. Not to argue with each other about important ideas is simply un-Jewish, and our tradition and people have always benefited when different perspectives are brought to bear on those great issues. Tonight's conversation is intrinsic, I believe, to being Jewish. It will be reflected by all of our speakers in their honesty, intelligence, love for the Jewish people, land, and state of Israel, and by civility towards each other. I wish to thank first Serena Zeiss, the regional director of J Street, for working with us at Temple Israel to set up this conversation, as well as Amos Buhai, J Street's political director in this region. A few words about our two speakers, and I'll introduce the rabbis at a later point. Jeremy Ben-Ami, to your left, is the founder and executive director of J Street and J Street PAC, the political voice of what J Street calls the pro-Israel, pro-peace movement in the United States. From 2003 to 2004, Jeremy was the policy director for Howard Dean's presidential campaign. In 2001, he was one of the managers of Mark Green's mayoral campaign in New York City. And from 1992 through 1996, he worked with former President Bill Clinton, serving for 2 years as the president's deputy domestic policy advisor. In 1998, Jeremy started a consulting firm in Israel, which worked with Israeli nonprofit organizations and politicians. His father was a fighter in the Irgun, one of Israel's underground movements before statehood. Before establishing J Street, Jeremy was senior vice president of Fenton Communications, a public interest communications firm. David Suissa, to your right, interesting how they set themselves up. We didn't tell them where to sit.
To his left.
It really depends on your perspective.
That's right. Now, if we took a mirror and put it up, it would be the other way around. And we may find that they agree on a lot of things that we don't expect. But David is the founder and CEO of Suissa Miller Advertising, a marketing firm named Agency of the Year by USA Today that attracts clients including Heinz, Dole, McDonald's, Princess Cruises, Charles Schwab, and Acura. And I assume that you get to go on those cruises from time to time. David's writings on advertising have been published in several publications, including the LA Times and Advertising Age. He is the founder, publisher, and editor of Olam magazine, a magazine devoted to Jewish unity and spirituality, and is behind an activist movement rallying worldwide support for Israel and democracy in the Middle East. Recently, David launched a billboard and newspaper campaign promoting Israel and its democratic values. He co-founded the Israel Task Force, a group of business and community leaders rallying Israeli PR activities under one umbrella. He hails from Morocco, a Sephardic Jewish family. He writes a weekly column for the Los Angeles Jewish Journal and frequently contributes to the Huffington Post. He lectures regularly around the country and on college campuses on the subjects of spirituality in Israel. The format for this evening will be as follows. Jeremy will speak first, followed by David, each for about 15 minutes each. Then they will turn to each other and dialogue in whatever direction they wish to take it. Following that, I will invite each of our contributing rabbis to pose questions to our speakers, representing the viewpoints of their respective communities. Finally, we will take written questions from you, depending upon how much time we have, through the use of cards that we will distribute and then collect. I want to begin by asking both Jeremy and David to respond in your remarks to whatever you like, but if you can include reflections on this as well. What does it mean to be pro-Israel today? What are your views on a two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? What do you believe is the appropriate role of the American Jewish community vis-a-vis Israel? Do you believe that it is legitimate for the American Jewish community to publicly criticize Israeli government policy and still claim to be pro-Israel? What constitutes delegitimization of Israel? And should a resolution to establish a Palestinian state come before the United Nations in September as is promised? What will be your position, if you've developed it privately or publicly at this point? So Jeremy, we begin with you. B'hatzlacha, followed by David.
Terrific. Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and let me begin this evening by just a brief thank you to Rabbi John Rosoff for hosting this event and for creating an environment that I hope will be a bit of a model, not simply here in Los Angeles, but I hope something that we can talk about around the country. And as I'm thanking Rabbi Rosoff, I also want to thank David Suissa for participating in this discussion. We have had our differences on matters of policy and matters of opinion. I know that I've read some very wise words from David about the need to be humble in one's opinions, that whatever we think we know, we're just as likely to find out later we didn't really know all that well. And as we express our opinions, we need to understand that this is part of an ongoing learning process that we are all experiencing as we live through these incredible times. And I think as we as a community struggle with some very difficult issues, it is so important to have the opportunity for us to model the opportunity to debate, discuss, even argue at times in a civil and respectful manner. And so I thank you, Rabbi Rosoff, for creating this event and this opportunity for us to model that. The questions that you've outlined, I think, are really fundamental to the overarching topic that has become a conversation for not only the American Jewish community, but really for the worldwide Jewish community, of what does it mean to be pro-Israel? What does it mean to love and to support the concept of Israel and the people of Israel, when at times we have before us some very difficult issues around which we're going to disagree? This is a topic that is not simply in our community. It has made its way into the halls of the Knesset recently, with actually a Knesset hearing into that very question of what does it mean, and can an organization like J Street, which at times is very critical of government policies of the state of Israel, can we call ourselves pro-Israel while being critical? So these are not simply our own questions here in LA. They aren't simply our questions in the United States. They are questions that affect us as a people of 15+ million people all around the world as we relate amongst ourselves and to the national home of our people, which is Israel. So what does it mean to be pro-Israel? Well, I have 5 basic principles that we adhere to at J Street, and I thought that might be a good way of answering some of the questions and maybe throwing it over then to you, David. The first principle of our vision of this is there can be no question about the right of the Jewish people to a nation state of their own. Just like all other peoples in the world have a right to have a national home, so too do the Jewish people. And that state, miraculously, is in the land of Israel, which was the national home of our people millennia ago. And it is a miracle and a wonder that our people have returned there. I know my history personally is that my great-grandparents were part of the very first wave of Aliyah, the first wave of immigration in the 1880s from Russia to help recreate that national home. And I personally, and J Street as a movement, and I think all of us, would agree that the threshold principle, the number one point, is that the Jewish people have a right to this home, that nation has a right to defend itself from attack, and as with all other nations, it should be respected and given the right to make decisions that affect its own safety and security. So that's sort of point one, is that we are unapologetically pro-Israel in the sense of defending its right to exist and defending its right to defend itself. Second, and this begins to get more controversial, let's say, is our definition of being pro-Israel is not the traditional definition of the word pro, which requires an anti. We don't necessarily see the fundamental conflict between the Palestinian people and the Jewish people over the same piece of land as a black and white, us versus them conflict. We see this as two peoples who both have a legitimate claim to the right to have a nation of their own. And we believe that the long-term security, and in fact the survival of the state of Israel, requires that there be a Palestinian state. And as David has pointed out, this isn't controversial. This isn't a new idea. This is something that has emerged over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades, and I hope is, even in this room tonight, relatively accepted, that Israel has the following 3 items on the table. It has all of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean that it can control. It has its Jewish character as the national home of our people and a state that has a majority of Jewish people living there. And it has its democratic character and its respect for the rights of all of the people who live there, which is something guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence of the state and very fundamental to who we are as a people. But it can't have all 3. It can't have all the land and remain Jewish and democratic. It has to choose 2 of the 3. If it wants to be both Jewish and democratic, it's going to have to give up the land on which a Palestinian state is going to be created. And that is the only way that we can have an Israel for our children and our grandchildren and for the generations to come that is, in fact, living up to the ideals of our people. And so that's the second principle for us of being pro-Israel, that, in fact, the only way to maintain a secure, democratic, and Jewish Israel is to have a 2-state solution and to have a homeland for the Palestinian people living side by side in peace and security. Third, we believe that being pro-Israel means having an obligation to be engaged with the state, to be engaged in a conversation and engaged in a relationship with it as Jews who do not live there. And that includes being able to criticize policies that the government chooses to follow, with all due respect, understanding that the decisions that are to be made must be made by the people who live there. But as friends and as family who have provided money, who have provided support, who have organized lobbying, who have sent our kids to visit on birthright, who go there as tourists, who have been asked to make Aliyah or may have even tried to make Aliyah and come back, that we have a stake in what is going on over there. Our shares may not be of the same voting rights as the shares that are held by the people who live there, but as Jews around the world, we have a stake and a share in what's going on, and we have the right to speak our minds, even if it is at odds with a particular government and a particular policy. And that is light years different from being anti-Israel and delegitimizing the fundamental right of the Jewish people to a home of their own. And drawing that distinction between criticism and delegitimization is one of the biggest challenges that I think we have in the conversation as a community, because too often people hear a criticism of a government policy and they lump it automatically as something that delegitimizes the state itself. And I think we, as a community, will be a lot healthier if we recognize that friends, at times, try to help their friends by pointing out where they're making a mistake or they're headed in the wrong direction. And that's an act of love, and it's not an act of delegitimization. So that's the third principle, that in fact, criticism is a part of a loving and supportive relationship. Fourth, it goes to the point that we started with, which is the notion of the open and vibrant discussion, that in fact it is pro-Israel to have this deep engagement, to have this kind of conversation, because if we don't have it, if we say we're not going to permit there to be more than one view, if we're not going to let people have at it in a public way, you're cutting off an avenue for expression of that love and engagement. And as the rabbi said, this is a fundamentally Jewish characteristic. We have gained our knowledge as a people over thousands of years by arguing. And that is the way that we advance our thinking. And so the notion that we must make the space in our community for debate, for dissent, for open and vibrant discussion is fundamentally Jewish. It is part of being pro-Israel. And we as a community, whether it's at federations or at Hillels or at synagogues or at JCCs, we have got to make the space for those who have differing viewpoints, be they from the right or from the left or from the center. And all of those views need to be welcome within the communal tent. And so that's part of being pro-Israel, and that's our fourth principle. Fifth and last, and then I'll stop and turn it over to David. And I'll comment a bit on the UN before I do. Fifth is to root what we do in the values that we hold so dear as a people. We teach our kids, and we were just discussing this a little bit in the reception next door, we teach our kids that there are certain values and principles that are fundamental to being Jewish. And we teach them to apply those values and those principles to any issue that they encounter. And that's why we're so proud when our kids at the religious schools act on the principle of tikkun olam, and they adopt community service projects, and they are aware of what's going on in Darfur, and they walk for the homeless, and they march on other current issues of the day. They must be able to apply those values when it comes to Israel. And to ask, why is it that we treat another people the way that we wouldn't want to be treated ourselves, when that is the fundamental tenet of our people? So the ability to apply those values is, to me and to us, a fundamental part of what it means to be pro-Israel. To hold up those values, say, this is who we are, this is what we are as a people. Now, is the state of our people living up to those values? Because that state, to be our state, should be living according to those values we say apply on everything else. So that's the fifth component to me of what it means to be pro-Israel. I think that's a good enough start for a conversation about what it means. I do want to just answer the question about the UN, because as we then think about how do you apply all of this, the most important challenge that we're all going to face in the coming year is the fact that the United Nations this September will most likely be faced with a decision of does the United Nations vote to recognize an independent state of Palestine? And what will the United States do in that vote? And what will we want our administration to do? Those who believe in the cause of the Palestinian people and that they have a right to a state seem to think there's an easy answer, that you should vote yes. Those who believe that, that the United States should always stand with Israel have an easy answer and say no. It's not that simple in my mind. And J Street is making the argument that the most important thing that the President of the United States can do is try to avoid it coming to a vote in the first place. Because the real answer to this, the real resolution of this conflict, is an agreed upon resolution between the two peoples, between the Palestinian and the Jewish peoples, about how to end this conflict. And if the United States can get a true diplomatic process going again in the next few months and can delay a September vote, that would be the best possible outcome, because I believe that a vote to recognize a Palestinian state would actually be a detriment to the long-term cause of peace and security for Israel and the Palestinian people. And we can discuss that more in the conversational part. I'll turn it over to David at this point.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint all my friends on the right. They've been emailing me for the past couple of weeks, pleading with me to take the gloves off and show you how bad J Street is. There's a whole hit list, if you're on the right, of the anti-J Street hit list. They invite BDS people to their conventions, and, they didn't condemn the Goldstone report, and they, schlepped them around Washington. Was that the words they used?
It's a charge, incorrect, but yes.
Right. Anyhow, and they didn't support the veto that President Obama brought to the UN, which was extremely critical of Israel. And there are just a whole bunch of them. They were not exactly upfront on the funding from George Soros and so forth. So for somebody who wasn't going to bring those up, I've done a pretty good job.
You can check that off.
Yeah. So now I took care of my friends. But that's not what turns me on. I'm not a trial lawyer. I'm not Dershowitz. I'm a marketing guy. I'm a lover of Jews, lover of people, lover of Judaism, lover of Israel. And what turns me on is not so much whether J Street is right or wrong. What turns me on in life is what works. That's what turns me on. So one of my problems with J Street is I'm not sure what they've done has worked. I think it's failed royally. If you just look at their two ideas and their slogan, which I love, pro-peace and pro-Israel, if you just start with pro-peace, it's really a bad record. If you were around a couple of years ago, a long time ago, the Palestinians and the Israelis used to actually talk to each other. And since J Street and Obama have come onto the scene, for some reason, we've gone from a Grand Canyon to the Dead Sea. I got a whole bunch of metaphors on this one. We've gone from emergency room to a coma, got a whole list. But it's really in bad shape. The peace process has been killed, virtually. And one of the reasons is the policy of elevating the issue of Jewish settlements as the mother of all obstacles. I have very good friends of mine on the left who have admitted to me that that policy was extremely misguided, and it's a policy that J Street promoted quite aggressively, obviously, and it was President Obama's policy, and now we got a big mess. And I think there's three things that happened for why this policy has been so disastrous. And the first one is easy, it's obvious, because it gave the Palestinians a perfect excuse to stay away from peace talks. It's not that they were too enthusiastic in the first place, and we have not been able to undo that blunder, by the way. Nothing has been able to undo it. Not the 10-month settlement freeze, not Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at Bar Ilan recognizing a two-state solution. Nothing has been able to undo this initial blunder, even when President Obama, I think, realized it was a blunder. We still have not been able to get these two parties into the same room for some meaningful peace talks, which they were in 2.5 years ago. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that by condemning settlements, you might really believe, you might be really against settlements, but the minute you start condemning settlements, then you start to reinforce this global narrative that this is stolen land. This is not stolen land, it's disputed territory. The fact that Israel has been open to offering concessions on land is because of peace, its desire for peace. It's not an admission of theft. And by condemning settlements, it's reinforced the narrative that Israel is thieves. And you know what? If you think the land is stolen, what's there to talk about? Send it back. I have no reason to talk to you because I think you stole the land. I don't even owe you to have a meeting because you stole the land. Put it on a FedEx bag, send it, and I want punitive damages. So you might be against settlements, but there are consequences to that condemnations that are not good for the peace process. And all I'm talking here about is the peace process. And then I thought I was going to be at a podium, so I had some notes, so if you forgive me. And then the third one, which I now remember, which might be the most lethal of all, is the obsession with settlements. Covered up. Real obstacles to peace. And you know, people talk about settlements as an obstacle to peace. Why should they be an obstacle to peace? Has Israel not shown its ability to dismantle settlements, whether they had a deal with Yamit in the Sinai or whether they had no deal in the Gaza? If Israel has shown its ability to dismantle settlements, why should that be an obstacle to peace? The J Street policy has turned the settlements not just into an obstacle to peace, but into an obstacle to the peace process. And as a result, real obstacles to peace have been covered up. How many do you want? I'll just give you one. It's called Hamastan, that great, wonderful organization that believes it has a religious obligation to murder Jews. When J Street talks about a two-state solution, what they're not telling you is that it's really a three-state solution. There's Israel, and there's Fatah, and then there's Hamas. So when we talk about the idea of a two-state solution, somehow we have this inconvenient truth called Hamas. And I've heard Jeremy, by the way, he's really good, because I've heard him talk about this and how to address this issue. And he uses great language, and it's very creative, and using third parties and so forth. And I think he understands it's an extremely difficult problem, an extremely serious obstacle. But I got to tell you, I'm in the marketing business, and you can spin words, but you can't spin evil. And any entity that wants to murder my people is evil. And I just don't have much faith that some creative formulation is going to somehow embrace or help us fix the problem of an entity that is more than willing to take over the West Bank and have 20,000 rockets ready to go on Tel Aviv and Ben Gurion Airport. So it is not just an obstacle to peace. The presence of Hamas as a third state is the mother of all obstacles. It's the real obstacle to peace. So this obsession with settlements has really covered up some fundamental problems. And I think the most fundamental problem of all, which I wrote in the Jewish Journal in a letter to Obama a couple of years ago, and I don't think he reads the Jewish Journal, but he might. But you know what I said, and I say it again, is peace is not a goal. Peace is a result. If you had called it the education process, we would have maybe had peace. So the idea of making peace into a goal is the metaphor I use is you have a flower, a little sapling, and you keep pouring it into the sand, and it just won't stick, and you keep asking yourself, why won't it stick? And the reason it won't stick is because there's no nutrients in the earth. And the nutrients is called education of peace. If you've told your people for 20 years that the right of return of 5 million Palestinians to Israel proper is a sacred right that we can never compromise on, I'm always afraid when he takes notes. I have to go back and, you know, if you marinate your people in Jew hatred for 20 years, how do you undo that? How do you go back to them and say, you know, we lied to you? It's not true. So there's an absence of nutrients in that earth, and that's why this idea of trying to ram through a peace agreement seems to constantly fail. So we're left now with a real mess. But I gotta hand it to Jeremy and to my friends on the left, because they really nail me with one. And even Rob nails me with it every time I see him. All my friends on the left, they have this one fantastic argument. What do we do now? It's a great argument. It's a great question. All right, Suissa, you're right. Maybe J Street idea of pushing the settlement freeze was not a good idea. And maybe the parties are really, really, really far apart. But what do we do now? Because we all love peace. We all love Israel. So what do? You can't just sit here and criticize and say that it's not a good plan and then nothing's going to happen. So what do? Now, J Street has a few sort of arguments. There are the classic. The first classic argument for why we need to push for peace quickly is the classic, the big one, the one that Jeremy brought up on, you can't be Jewish, democratic, and have all the land. It's got to be 2 out of 3. And that one is, which means that if we sort of incorporate all the Palestinians, the West Bank into Israel, God forbid we're going to have too many Arabs. God forbid we should have too many Arabs in Israel. People say, well, they have a higher birth rate in Israel, so let's just say if we do have a two-state solution, and then you have a higher birth rate in Israel, we're 5,000 years old, maybe in 150 years, there'll be 51% Arab. Whenever I say that to my friends on the left, they look at me and say, how about those Lakers? But there's a racist idea to saying we can't have too many Arabs in Israel. So although I have sympathy for the idea of Jewish democratic, we have to be careful how we tread. We should tread carefully on that idea. I like peace because I like peace. Not necessarily because I don't like the idea of having too many Arabs in my country. The second big argument that J Street is using, again, if you don't mind, the idea now of the upheaval in the Middle East. Because of the upheaval in the Middle East, now it's more important than ever to have a two-state solution. I've been hearing for 20 years, more important than ever. All right, but then I look at that and I say, really? I thought it was the exact opposite. The upheaval in the Middle East means that regimes come and go. So would you want to make an agreement now with a regime that might be going? That doesn't look too smart to me. And then the third big argument that they use is that the Palestinians really have gotten their act together. I was in Ramallah. I saw it with my own eyes. There's all kinds of cranes. They're building condominium complex. I had a cappuccino in Ramallah that looked like the one I have at Earth Cafe. So there are great things happening in the West Bank. Jenin used to be a terrorist city. Now it's thriving. There's even a new city that they're building. So the economy is doing well. But I have news for you. You know why it's doing well? Because they're protected by Israel. You call it occupation, but you might also call it protection. Now, are you ready to risk taking this protection right out and then having an open field for Hamas to come over and take over the West Bank, or at the very least have a civil war and risk all the gains, those wonderful gains that have happened in the West Bank? I'm not sure. So that's not a slam dunk either. And then finally, the big one is the United Nations in September. And Jeremy spoke about that. And I'm also very distressed about it. I forgot one. The settlers. The settlers are, encroaching on the land. Every day, it makes the Palestinian state less and less feasible. And I'm thinking, why is that? They're less than 2% of the settlement. There hasn't been a new settlement since 1993. It's been at the lowest level of construction. So I'm thinking, how is that encroaching on a future Palestinian state? And then I'm thinking, who the hell ever heard of kicking people out of their homes? I was born in an Arab country. I lived with Arabs. I went to school with Arabs. We have 1 million Arabs in Israel. Why can't we have Jews in Palestine? I kind of like the idea of having Jews in a Palestinian parliament. So why? There is a really racist idea. When I hear Prime Minister Abbas say, not one Jew, not one Israeli Jew will live in Palestine, I'm thinking, that's racist. That's apartheid, my friend. That's apartheid. So I'm thinking, this idea of assuming that we have to just transplant these people out, I think it's not a peaceful idea. I think if we want to have a great Palestinian state that's democratic, it's healthy to have a minority. And if the Palestinians really had peaceful intentions, they would look at the Jews as somebody that can help their country, that can help their democracy, in the same way that the Arabs bring a lot to Israel. in the same way that it was an Arab judge who convicted the president of rape and sexual assault in Israel, former President Katsav. So this is what I'm looking at right now, and I'm saying, you know, the last reason that I mentioned, Jeremy, before was the United Nations. It's true that United Nations is an enormous problem. You might have seen the piece by David Horowitz on that, and it's chilling. If you think Israel is isolated now, just wait. Because this gives a tremendous amount of credibility to the boycott movement. But when I look at that, you know, there's a J Street, if you go on their website, they're pushing now for a big new American initiative. You know, I got news for you. The big new American initiative, it happened 2 years ago with the settlement freeze. So right now, there's only one initiative that makes sense to me. And that initiative is for J Street and President Obama and the whole Jewish community, including AIPAC, should all get together and ask the Palestinians to come back to the peace table. And you know, Jeremy and J Street are fantastic at putting pressure on Israel. But where's the pressure on the Palestinians? One of their answers is that they're not a Palestinian organization. They're an Israel-driven organization, so they focus more on the behavior of Israel, not the behavior of the Palestinians. But in the same breath, J Street says that they're an American organization, and if something is in the American interest, then they will push for that as well. So why can't they push America to push the Palestinians to come back to the peace table? I never thought I would get applause. Temple Israel, really. This is pretty good. Anyhow, so it's such an obvious point. Now let's talk about pro-Israel. You know, a few weeks ago, I was driving up. Jeremy was talking about values for our kids, and my 12-year-old boy, and I was taking him on this long trip to the valley to play basketball on a Sunday. And then he says, you know, Daddy, everybody's talking about your articles at Maimonides at school. What's going on? And I said to him, I said, what do you mean? He said, you know, why is everybody talking about your articles? Now, you have to understand, I've only talked about the Lakers with, no, I think he wants me to finish. I'm almost done.
What I want you to do is to dialogue with each other.
Oh, I will.
Okay, so perhaps
let me finish the story.
I'm a Laker fan, so I appreciate what you're doing. But I think just in order, because we have other questioners, but I would like an opportunity, Jeremy, if you can respond to some of the things that David has said. And then perhaps in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the way they used to do it is one would speak for an hour and a half, then another one, no, an hour, and then another one would speak for an hour and a half, and then the last one would speak for half an hour. So I think that's kind of the way we're moving it here. So what we'll do is, Jeremy, I'd like you to speak for a while.
Minutes.
Pardon?
I'm not done with my 15 minutes.
No, it's about 25 minutes.
Okay, good.
So, Jeremy, if you would speak for a while, and then perhaps we can bring up some...
They want the story for my boy. Let's have a vote. Who wants the story for my boy? I'm going to give you my boy's story. So here's what he asked. How come everybody's talking about your articles in the Jewish Journal? So here's what I told him. And I've never talked to him about politics, ever. And, you know, for one of the few times in my life, I was left speechless. And I said to him, after a few minutes, I said, Noah, Israel makes a lot of mistakes. It's not a 10 out of 10. It's not a 9 out of 10. It's probably not an 8 out of 10. It's probably a 7 out of 10. Some people think it's a 6. Others think it's an 8. But you know, the whole world right now, most of the world, is trying to turn Israel into a 1 or even a 0. And your father right now is fighting the injustice in that gap. And then I figured it even works with grown-ups. So I'm using it now with grown-ups. And that is one of the reasons that I think one of the values we teach our kids is injustice. And I believe there is an injustice in the reality of Israel and the perception that has been created by a world that has focused and demonized us beyond any proportion whatsoever. And I don't think being pro-Israel means you can't criticize Israel whatsoever. I think you can criticize Israel. I think the idea of being pro-Israel is to ask yourself the question, what's the best thing I can do to help Israel? How do I, but now, J Street has answered that question. They believe in doing what they're doing to help Israel. But you know, tough love without love is just tough. And I think if I want to leave you with just one thought, is you can hate the settlements. You can be a big proponent of two-state solution. You can be liberal. You can be a member of J Street. And you can really want peace. But you can also defend Israel at the same time.
So, I think the good news is that there's a lot that David and I agree on. I will tick off some of those as a way of starting. First of all, I actually think it may come as a surprise to you to know that we at J Street actually think it was a very big mistake for the administration to be focused on a settlement freeze. The settlements are not the be-all and end-all issue, and I think it is important to acknowledge that. I think they're a symptom of an underlying problem that is eating away at the chances of Israel's long-term security and survival, and that is the lack of a border. What is, to my mind, the final step in Zionism, the final piece of the work that's been done over the past century and a quarter, where we've pioneered and come to the land and we've built a country and we've fought for it and defended it and all of that we've been a part of as partners, whether we live there or not. The final step of that is to have fixed borders that allow us to say to our neighbors, this is where we end and you begin, and to say to the world, recognize us in these borders. And once there are borders, you know where you can build and where you can't build. And Gilo and Ramat Shlomo, they will be within the borders of Israel. And some of the outlying settlements will be outside. And maybe Ariel is in or it's out, I don't know. But the majority of the blocks will be in. And so I see you nodding, and I think we probably agree that a reasonable border keeps 70% of the settlers within Israel. Anybody's concept of a deal generally provides for land swaps to make up for the land from the West Bank that is kept. And I think it was a mistake for the administration to focus solely on the settlements as in and of themselves the whole problem. The energy that was devoted to pressing for a settlement freeze, I think would have been so much better expended in pressing for clarity on a border. And then
But you didn't support the veto, and the veto condemns settlements as being
separate the two issues. So on whether or not it was a mistake to make the political fight 2 years ago about settlements, or whether the president and his team would have been better served to focus on a border and security arrangements, I think that was a tactical mistake, and I think a lot of political capital was used up. So I do think you'd be surprised. I think we would agree on that. So take the UN. I also think we'd agree on the fundamental premise that the United Nations and many of the international bodies that are associated with it are prejudiced, biased against Israel. This is an institution and a set of institutions that are fixated on Israel.
Why didn't you support the veto then?
But that's a separate issue. The veto is a separate issue. The veto says, in the words of the policy of 8 American administrations, that what is happening over the Green Line is illegal. And that's something that in 1978, the U.S. State Department legal advisor came out with an opinion that said exactly that. The policy language that was in the resolution is the exact language that has been used by 8 presidential administrations regarding the settlements.
Can I rebut that? Okay.
So for the United States to veto its own policy in an international institution undercuts American credibility in the international community's eyes, and that in of itself is not good for Israel.
In that resolution, it included the Western Wall. If you take that resolution literally, we're not allowed to build a sukkah now at the Western Wall. But the American policy is also that the peace must happen between these two parties. The American policy is that peace should not be happening at the United Nations or negotiated United Nations. So in a way...
And that's in the resolution. The resolution, the wording of the resolution, I don't have it in front of me, but the resolution calls for the two parties to negotiate a resolution to the conflict. It's exactly what the resolution calls for, and we vetoed it.
Yeah, but you know what? I mean, this idea of adding on more condemnation of the settlements, I don't know how you can think that that's a good idea. Because on the one hand, you speak from two sides of your mouth. On the one hand, you say that elevating the settlements in the beginning by insisting on a settlement freeze was a bad idea. It was a bad idea because it covered up some more fundamental problem. Anything you do to reinforce this condemnation is going to have the same problem. And we're living in a hostile world.
Well, let's be clear. There's no question in my mind, no question in J Street's mind. Israel should stop building settlements, period. Israel should stop building settlements.
Why?
It should not stop building settlements because other people tell it to. It should stop building settlements because they're wrong and because it's not in its own self-interest. Since 1992, you said there's been no increase. I mean, it's important to have facts.
No new settlements, no new towns. That's what I mean.
Well, I mean, that itself isn't true, right? Since 1992, the number of settlers who lived over the Green Line outside of East Jerusalem in 1992 was 130,000.
Oh, I know it's gone up.
Today it's 300,000. In the time, that's not just gone up, that's more than 2.5 times
because
more.
Oslo did not say you're not allowed. You see, Oslo did not have a clause in there, forbidding the growth of settlements.
But the roadmap does, and the roadmap says that, and the roadmap lays out all the obligations that both sides said they were going to agree to, part of which was to stop the growth in settlements, and Israel has not stood by that. The reason, though, Israel should do these things is not because the United States tells it, is not because the UN tells it. It's as Tzipi Livni says. We're not doing anybody any favors. Do what is in Israel's best interest. That should be the guiding principle for the state of Israel.
I laugh at this because, I look at a potential terrorist army coming into the West Bank and pointing 20,000 rockets at us, and then I look at a little family adding a bedroom in Efrat, and I'm saying, which one of the two are more of an obstacle to peace? It's not that I'm pro-settlement, don't get me wrong. All I'm saying is that by putting such an inordinate emphasis on it, you are creating a distorted picture that covers up some more fundamental problems to peace. When you talk about dismantling settlements, I think we should dismantle the hatred that is taught in Palestinian society. That's a lot more of an obstacle to peace. That hatred is a lot more of an obstacle to peace than settlements that we've already shown we will dismantle for a peace agreement.
Well, let me ask, is there anybody here who's in favor of Palestinian incitement? All right, so can we just all agree, can we have a round of applause from the entire audience that the Palestinians should stop incitement to hate and terror?
But it's one thing, but you have to do something about it.
Right, so let's call as a united community that it is absolutely essential that if there is to be peace between Israel and the Palestinian people, there must be an end to incitement to hatred and to terror. So let's take that as a given.
Well,
let's take that as a given.
J Street is a great marketing organization. I'm a member of J Street because they send me all their emails, and they're really good. They're really good. They have great campaigns, great letter writing campaigns. They're very slick. They got the real act together. So I'm saying, if you really believe that, why don't you start a campaign tomorrow to fight, to unravel the hatred and the incitement in Palestinian society? Well, I'm giving you my permission.
And if we start a campaign that calls for that on the one hand, and for Israel to stop building settlements on the other, would you join me in that campaign?
Aye.
I'm willing.